Hi, I'm Sophia, and I'm here to introduce our speaker today, which is Phil Estes from IBM. Phil has been involved in the container open source world for almost 5 years, starting with the explosion of the Docker Engine open source project in 2014. Phil has been a maintainer in the Docker Engine, as well as today in the CNCF Containered project, as well as creating a few of his own open source projects over the years. Phil gets to travel the world talking about open source and containers, and one of his goals is to ride a bike in every place he visits. Please help me welcome Phil.
All right. Thank you all for showing up. I hope that the smaller crowd means that people are enjoying some of the sessions I would have sent people to if you weren't here, because there's a lot of great sessions in the same slot. Some of my friends are speaking that I'll have to watch by video. And hopefully it means that maybe a lot of people here already know how to contribute to open source and are already doing it. So this is cool. Maybe we'll have extra time for questions, for things that I don't get to cover during the talk. But again, as Sophia said, I've been working in open source for quite a number of years, both in the Docker engine as a maintainer. Since about 2015, I actually got involved in the project late in 2014. Most of my time in open source today is working on Containerd, which, if you were in the keynotes, that's a CNCF project that just graduated a few months ago. And then I have a few tools. Maybe we'll talk about them very briefly toward the end. These are tools I thought I was just creating because I had an interest and sort of scratch my own itch, but they've actually ended up contributed to and used by many others, so that's been kind of fun. And then over, again, these last 5 years, I've created tons of pull requests. I've reviewed them and merged them, and so I've kind of seen a lot in 5 years, especially given the activity in the Docker open source ecosystem. So hopefully I can share a few tips and tricks if you're interested in getting involved. Really the premise of why I submitted this talk to DockerCon and why I'm not talking about Containerd or some deep technical topic is that I've had the pleasure of working for an employer who has given me a lot of freedom and the enablement to contribute to open source. And really, in the last few years, we've seen a huge explosion of companies not just consuming it, but also starting to give back. And I thought these stats that another IBMer shared recently were interesting. I'm sorry I didn't have time to find out which study this was. If you're interested, I'm sure I can find out at a later date. But effectively, tons of companies are using open source. Even if you have a single cloud instance and a cloud provider running Linux, obviously you're already using tons of open source just by nature of the fact of the Linux operating system that's running in that cloud instance. The great thing is really the growth in this bottom number is that companies are starting to encourage more actively their employees to give back to open source, not just to use it, which obviously is very popular, but to start to give back in some way. And so hopefully if you're here, this is kind of my pre-101, what has to happen to even sort of get to that gate of starting to get involved in open source. One, I'm going to be very clear that I can't give you permission to work on open source software. Obviously, if you're an independent developer, if you're a student, that's up to you. But if you are employed and receive a paycheck from an employer, then you will most likely have to get permission from your employer to actually contribute to open source, because the second box there are a set of principles that you probably should know about open source software. How is it licensed? What software do we write in our company, and how might that compete or clash with our work in open source software? And so, given you get permission and you understand the principles behind it, I would say that passion is a requirement, just in the sense that open source is not always easy. There can be complicated relationships with people all over the world, upstream, and so your passion will hopefully drive you to to be able to deal with some of the headaches of dealing with different communities, different types of personalities, people all over the world, and that's just the nature of open source and the fact that people are usually a much bigger problem than technology in our world. So a few caveats about my presentation. This is, again, my personal story. So there's a few things I want to make clear because I'm going to be sort of sharing my story and then practical tips from it. Open source software does not mean GitHub. GitHub is a very, very popular place for open source projects, but it's absolutely not the only place that open source software is collaborated. If you know anything about the Linux kernel, it is not, you can actually find it on GitHub, but that's not where development happens. It happens external to GitHub. And again, there are other places, there are other repositories where people share and contribute and work on open source software. But I'm going to be focusing on GitHub. We only have so much time, and that's the experience I have. I also want to make it very, very clear that you can be involved in open source without being a software developer, without being a coder. There are plenty of ways that open source projects could really use your help and your input. Many times that's through writing documentation or clarifying how the tests are run or adding tests or providing other, helping manage the website for the project. And so there are lots and lots of ways that you can contribute to open source software without necessarily being a coder. Again, this talk, I'm a software developer, and so my experience is contributing in that way. Open source is an extremely vast topic. Your mileage may vary because I can't cover every situation, every project, the kinds of projects and the kinds of things you might encounter. But again, I'll hopefully share some things that are somewhat broad and apply to many situations. And just to reiterate, I'm not a lawyer if you've never seen that acronym before. I can't give you permission. I can't tell you all the details of open source licensing, nor am I authorized to do so. That's between you and your employer about how you're going to work with open source software. So with that said, kind of step one, and the step I took about 5 years ago when my manager came to me and said, hey, we do a lot of open source and this Docker thing looks really, really popular. We need a few developers to go, investigate this open source project, see if you can get involved, see ways that IBM can help, maybe enable it for our platforms, and that came later. And although I had been working in IBM's Linux Technology Center up to that point, I had never worked with a project on GitHub. And so obviously I came to this lovely page at github.com, and obviously like most websites, there's a fairly easy sign-up process. And again, almost every project you're going to want to contribute is here. That doesn't mean every interesting open source project is here, but GitHub is obviously a very popular place that provides a lot of tooling and a lot of help for projects to coordinate and collaborate. But before we move on, maybe I've already stepped a little bit too far, and I want to clarify what GitHub is, because maybe you've heard of Git, and you're kind of trying to understand how these two play together. So Git is really a source code system. Maybe you've used Subversion, maybe used other commercial products. But Git was created by Linus Torvalds, actually the author of the Linux kernel, as a way for the Linux kernel community to collaborate in a distributed source code control system. And it became very popular very quickly, was used by many other projects. And GitHub is a startup who effectively wrapped the Git protocol and the Git tooling with a hosted service that adds other features. So later when we talk about pull requests, Git, the source code control system, has no notion of a pull request. It just talks about source code commits, but GitHub has added this idea of making issues and making pull requests. And so these are different things, but they're very related because the Git tooling works nicely with GitHub, which adds, again, many features around that. I will say if you don't have an ID on GitHub, these are, again, very basic ideas, but I think they're worth mentioning just for the matter of fact of security and, again, the security of your company. So please, as you would with any website, use a strong password and turn on two-factor authentication. Again, this protects anyone contributing code under your name or using your ID to share malicious software. And then secondly, after you create an ID, have a strong password and two-factor auth. I think it's a great idea to sign your commits. And so you can add a PGP key to your GitHub account. I think I'm going to not go through that process and show you all that here because there's great documentation on GitHub itself to do that. But anyway, these are very good steps you can take. There's a somewhat humorous blog post by another Docker captain I've linked to here, and I'll share these slides later, where he actually used my identity to show how easy it would be if I don't sign commits to pretend like I'm contributing to his project. Because again, the commit logic in Git is just using my name and email address. So again, these are just, I think, good steps to take if you're getting started, getting involved. It's best to do these first and understand how it works. And that way, when you contribute, there's added security to the contributions that you're making. So again, there's so much I can't get into because of time, but I think some great kind of initial concepts that you should understand is that when you use GitHub, the top object is either a organization or your personal account. So when I go to github.com/EstusP, which is my personal account, you can see repositories that I've created underneath that. Or you can go to github.com/Docker or /containerd, and there you'll see all the projects that organization has created. And organizations in GitHub have obviously many other settings to like add people who are authorized to write and do activity in that organization. So underneath those sort of top level objects are where you actually have source code repositories that you would contribute to. And so in my case, I have Manifest Tool and Bucket Bench projects that I created under Docker. You've got the Docker client, you have BuildKit. Under Moby, you have the Docker engine. So again, these are kind of the top level objects that you would need to know about when you're trying to find a place to contribute or trying to navigate. Again, because I can't get into all these details, there is a great site called guides.github.com that if you've never done any sort of contribution or working with Git, this is a great starting point to help you understand those basic concepts that we don't have time to go through today. For example, in the bottom right corner, just even the Git handbook itself, like understanding the commands that you would use from a command line if you're going to contribute in that way. So I have an ID, I've set it up, I kind of understand how to navigate GitHub. What can I do next? And so there's a couple things we can do from here. Obviously, we can contribute to an existing project. And so in that case, along the top bar of a repository, such as the main containerd project, there is a button on the far right called Fork. And Fork simply makes a copy of that repository in my GitHub account. And we'll look at that in a minute and see how we go from there and what that means. Obviously, if I'm not looking to contribute to an existing project, maybe I want to create my own repository. And so again, GitHub has a very easy way to click New Repository. I give it a name, I give it a description, and from there I can actually make my own project that maybe I'm going to share with others or collaborate with someone else on GitHub. So once for me personally, again, I tend to work from the command line. I will actually want to clone that fork. And in the Git mantra, that means I'm actually going to take my forked version of that repository and make a copy of it somewhere. In this case, this is my MacBook. And so I'm actually going to point at my copy of the repository. So say I've forked a project called My New Repo. I'm now using this git at github.com. That's because I've authorized my SSH key. And again, great docs on that on GitHub on how to add that. And so now it's made a clone here, and you can see the list of files in this cloned repo that I've now have on my local machine. Now, if you think about your fork, there's also this upstream copy of the actual project. So think of it as two copies. I've got my cloned and forked copy of a repository, but there's also the one that when people go to github.com/whoever owns this my new repo, they're going to see maybe a different version, because if I make commits in my fork, they won't be present in the official Upstream project. So the first step I always do after cloning a repo is I use git remote add upstream. There is some philosophical debates about what you call that. I personally always call it upstream. And then I point to the actual organization repository on GitHub that I forked from. And so this means when I look at my remotes, I have something called origin, that's my fork, and I have something called upstream, which is the actual repo on GitHub itself. Does anyone have a repo that they would like me to fork just to show this live? Call out some repository that you think I should create a fork of. Anyone have one? Come on, don't be shy. Yeah. So this is my, so once you have an ID on GitHub, this is me, this is my repos on the side, your activity, and et cetera. Is this something we can search? Yeah. All right. Look at that. I may have actually gotten that right. That's you? See, we've already found okay. Let us do this. Yeah. Beaver? Tennis? Like that? So that's, uh-oh. What have I done wrong? What is it? I'm sorry, the echoey. Ah, okay. All right, so we have a tennis community. I'm not part of any tennis communities. So I'm actually part of several other repositories, but I'm actually wanting to fork this in my own. So I will select my own. GitHub shows this cute animation of forking and copier. And so now I have this local copy of Beaver PUR tennis. And so as I showed, I can now go here. And the way I like to do it is this was cloned from Naresh R08. So I'm actually going to create a directory Naresh R08. Is that correct? And now I'm going to use that clone command, but I'm doing my clone of it. And now that I know, so this is my copy of his repository now on my local machine, so I can go into that directory, and there is his repository in my local directory. So again, the basic idea there is that once I get to that point, I effectively have a copy of the repository that now I can start working and contributing to in. So before we talk about any practical steps of what it would look like to actually contribute something, I think a really important step is to understand what you're about to contribute to. And because every project is unique, There are really a couple kind of helpers, hopefully, if a project is set up for collaboration that we want to look for. The most popular is a file called contributing.md, a markdown file that hopefully gives you a guide of, hey, welcome new developer or new contributor. Here's how we do contribution in this repository. Here's how we use issues. Here's tags that we use on the issues, how to find our workflow, how to build our project. Again, the README, which GitHub shows you on the main page of any project that you visit. So again, when you go to github.com/containerd/containerd, our README is actually displayed there once you scroll past the code. And hopefully that gives people a good idea of what is this thing? What does it do? Who's involved? Who's using it? Any good amount of information about the project. Is there a license file? And if not, you should probably ask, what kind of code this is, how is it being collaborated on, what are the rights of the contributors, all those things are in essence, the terms and conditions of the project. And again, that goes back to your employer and what they would like you to be involved in. And then if it's a sort of mature project, maybe part of a foundation like the Linux Foundation or the CNCF, they're also required to have governance. And a lot of time that's put in a file called governance.md. Now my personal projects, I'm not going to create a governance.md because it's sort of my project and my README and anything else can kind of describe that. But with a mature project, a company that's maybe going to get involved and have people contributing, they want to know how are decisions made, how are maintainers added, or how are differences of opinion dealt with in that community. So a lot of times the governance file will give you that information so you can make a reasoned decision about the value of getting involved in that project. And then code of conducts are important. Again, not so much maybe in a personal project where there's not much collaboration, but anytime we're talking about a large community of people, it definitely should be a code of conduct. Again, there's not necessarily a common name for that, but you can look for a file called code of conduct or conduct that will detail, again, how issues that come up in that community are going to be dealt with in a proper way. So again, this hopefully is a way that when you approach a project, some amount of these files should exist and help you navigate what it would be like to contribute and what some of the regular practices are in that project. For me, when I came to the Docker project, I got that call from my manager, hey, why don't you go figure out the Docker community, get involved, see if you can help out. My first question is, where does this community congregate? Because GitHub, as a static website with issues and pull requests, is not the easiest way to actually interact with people. There's probably some channel of communication that you can get involved in and start to learn, who are the maintainers, who's actually making decisions in this project, who's helping new developers get acclimated to the project. So one option might be you find out that in the README or the contributing guide that there's a weekly developers call or some kind of contributors call, and maybe they even post the recordings publicly on YouTube or somewhere, or an audio file that you can actually catch up and kind of understand what kind of discussions and debates and information is happening among the contributors of that community. Obviously, it's very, very common that there'll be a Slack channel or a Slack team that you can join. IRC is still heavily used, maybe at some of the lower levels like Linux kernel and more of the Linux projects. But again, Slack or IRC, there's probably some place that this community congregates. And for me, that was extremely valuable in the Docker project because that's where I started to meet the people actually involved and know who to ping on GitHub or who to ask a question about, who's dealing with networking or the container runtime. And so these are, again, for me, I think it's valuable not just to sort of throw code at a project, but to actually understand who's involved and how you can communicate with them. Again, many projects will have a mailing list set up. Maybe there's several. Maybe there's one /dev, which is more focused on developers. Maybe there's a users mailing list. But usually you want to find the one where developers are congregating. Maybe there's a design discussion. Maybe that's where you find out that if you want to do a new feature, you got to propose it on the mailing list. So again, I think first impressions are important, so the more work you do to find out how a community operates probably gives you a better chance of sort of being recognized and welcomed in the community if you show some initiative to find out how they work, where they work, and how they communicate. And that can be really valuable. A lot of times it happens so much in the Docker project, the Containerd project, many of the large, Kubernetes, many of these large projects, a lot of people are interested in getting involved. But one of the first things that can be quite hard to do is find out, where do I start? I know nothing about this code base. I know nothing about this project, or I've looked through the source code, but it's so large and complicated. How do I find out where to begin? And so good and healthy and mature projects should have labels that help beginners find new issues to work on. And so the Docker Engine project, which is now at Moby/Moby on GitHub, uses the experience/beginner label. And so that's something you can actually search on when you go to the Moby project, and you can search through issues. Here I've actually made a screen capture. There's 23 open issues right now in the Moby project that say they're for a beginner. And so this is a great way to find an issue that's not too difficult, doesn't require a ton of detailed knowledge about the project. And again, this is a great place to go find that contributing file and see if they actually have some guide for how to find good first issues. I found this when I was preparing the talk. Again, I can share the slides later so you can actually click this rather than trying to take a picture or type it out. But there is a awesome for beginners GitHub project which sorts by language. So say you're a Python developer, hey, are there any cool Python projects that are set up with a good label for how to find new places to contribute, or Golang or Node.js? And so whoever is operating this repo allows projects to contribute, hey, my project is here, and here's how we point new contributors to new issues or good first issues. So the Moby project is actually listed there in the Awesome for Beginners, but you can find many other projects there as well. What you're going to do when you find work to do is you're going to, if you haven't done it before, you're going to learn about the concept of a pull request. And again, this is something that GitHub has created as a form of work within GitHub projects. And so again, we've already done this step one, which is really a one-time only step on the left there. And that's to fork the repository that you want to contribute to. And then obviously clone it to a system where you're going to actually use an IDE or an editor of some kind to make changes. Within that personal fork, you will create a branch. And again, this is part of the Git philosophy of development. Again, branches are part of many source code control systems. You'll create a branch, you'll edit files, and you'll use commands like git add. Actually, I think during the keynote, they did a git add and a commit of a file and pushed it to a repo. The cool thing about the keynote is to show that you can do that in many different ways. If you're not interested in command line, many IDEs, VS Code, for example, a popular editor IDE, lets you do all these git commands from pull-down menus, lets you do commits and pushes. But again, in my case, I usually am at the command line using commands like git add, git commit. And then you're going to push that, and that pushes to your personal fork that you made. It doesn't push it to the project that you don't have write access to, most likely, because you're just a contributor, first-time contributor maybe. It's then in the GitHub user interface that we can actually, it shows us, hey, you have a branch that has changes that are different from the project you forked. Would you like to create a pull request? And that process will create a pull request, and that will appear in the main project's list of open pull requests. And so as you contribute, this would be a cycle that you would repeat over and over as you contribute. And so we can potentially, I think we'll have a minute or two to show the anatomy of actually doing that, what that looks like. There are some common pull request activities, especially as you start to contribute more complex features. looking at the clock below me, I don't think we'll have time to show all these as sort of a demonstration, but these are all things you can learn from the GitHub Guides or from a great Git intro. But there's three main things that I think everyone should know, especially as you get into more complicated contribution. One is that to realize that especially in a popular project, you're not the only contributor. So the master project is constantly being updated and being changed. And so you may have to rebase your changes on top of existing other changes that have happened since you first opened your pull request. And so again, Git makes this easy. There are commands that you can actually take your code and rebase it on top of the current status of the project. And of course, if you've ever done anything with source control and multiple contributors, maybe your changes will clash and you have to deal with merging in changes or differences between the same line of code that maybe someone else has changed. So rebase is a very common activity. Repushing it, again, you get a maintainer who's reviewed your pull request and said, this looks good, but I'd like you to change this one area. And so you'll have to make changes locally and repush that to GitHub. And then squashing commits, again, people have different styles of development. Maybe every change you make, you're adding another commit. Maybe you're amending a prior commit and adding more changes to it. But many projects, when your PR is all ready, everyone's happy with it, everyone's ready to have it merged. Many projects will say, hey, we'd like this to be one commit, so it doesn't string it across many, many commits. And so you'll learn the git rebase command that allows you to squash commits. So again, these are three popular things you'll probably have to do with a pull request if you're active in open source over time on GitHub. A couple more things that I'd like to deal with that are less about code and learning a certain skill with GitHub or Git. And that's remembering that people, whether that's in your company, collaborating with people on your team, or collaborating with people across the world, is that everyone has their bad day, they've got their personal life, they have work pressures, and so you may deal with things like clashing opinions in an upstream project that you thought your code is exactly what it should be, and someone else doesn't think that. Or you may reach an impasse where your feature is not accepted by the community. They think for some reason there's not a reason to accept it. Or you may be trying to contribute to a very, very busy project and wondering why you get no response or very slow responses from communities. So here's a few tips I thought I'd put together. Again, this is from 5 years of watching people contribute, of helping review and maintain, and as well as contributing my own large features. It's obviously very, very hard for us as people to be patient because we perceive that we've done everything right, our code's good, it builds, it compiles, it passes tests. But I think extra patience is definitely valuable in open source communities, especially because a lot of time we're dealing with textual responses. We don't know the person's real intent. And so being extra patient can be really, really helpful, especially in busy communities. And here's where I think asking someone else who's not invested, there's emotions when it's our code, something we've written, ask someone you trust, hey, take a look at this string of comments and feedback. It's frustrating me. Do you think there's value in me kind of getting another perspective on that? Another, I think, valuable thing is really try to make life as easy as possible for maintainers and reviewers. That means, don't ignore the things the contributing guide told you to do. How many times do we get pull requests that don't even explain why they made the change they did, or it asks for a signed off by line in your commit on a very specific format and you just ignored it. So try and follow all the recommended steps for contributing. And really, I think this is where I think IBM's approach has been valuable, is we try and come into a project and not just work on the thing that's important to us, but fix bugs that are helpful to everyone. Make the test better. Clean up the contributors guide if you find something that is out of date. Take time to add those good descriptions that helps a maintainer understand why you're trying to make the change. And then again, just being polite being helpful in communication with other members of the community. A very, very quick comment on personal projects. Again, because I've created a few of my own that have ended getting contributions, which I didn't necessarily expect. First, your company probably has some process for actually open source. Even if it's something you wrote, maybe you do it on your personal time. That's between you and your employer how that works. Does the company own that project? Is it really your personal project? Determine the model of how you're have collaboration. Are you expecting people to open issues? Are you going to do releases? Try and make this all clear so people don't get confused when they come to your project and they don't really know, is it maintained? Try and make it easy, give people the clear details on how to contribute. Set some good expectations. Say, I'm not going to ever release this code. I'm just going to make commits. If you like it, use it. Or if you're going to have, every 6 months I'll cut a release and I'll put something on GitHub. So set some expectations, and then mark the project status. If for 6 months you thought you were going to make it into a big, useful project, all of a sudden something changes, update the README that says this project is no longer maintained so people don't waste time trying to understand if they can get value from it. I've said multiple times in this talk I've talked multiple times about your employer relationship, about how to get authorization to work on open source. There's a great talk tomorrow in the same time slot, in the same room, about establishing an open source program office. So if maybe at your company you'd like to have some good, clear guidance on what it means to contribute to open source, these two guys have both developed that at their companies, and so that'd be a great thing to attend if you want to learn more about that. I'm going to show you briefly just some things from IBM because I think they're valuable as sort of reference points. For example, internally at IBM, we have a bunch of guides on, how do I learn to contribute? How do I consume open source in my project? And we actually have to certify every year by taking a course, learning about the different types of licenses. If you don't have that, again, opensource.org is a great place to learn about common open source licenses. But again, this is something you'll want to figure out for your company. And again, if you don't have that, this would be a great talk to go to. And then say you're actually really interested to get started in open source. If you're here Thursday at DockerCon, the whole day is the Open Source Summit. There's different segments on different projects. So myself and some of the other Containerd maintainers will be in this room 2020 in this 2-hour slot. I'll be sharing a little bit about IBM's use of Containerd. There'll be the other maintainers there sharing about the design and architecture. If you're interested in BuildKit and some of the other open source projects, again, Thursday would be a great chance because there'll be open kind of discussion sections of that 2-hour window where you can actually maybe talk about getting involved and get a little more detail on that. So with that, we have a couple minutes left. I was going to just create a pull request from the command line, but I think maybe I'll just open it up in case there's one or two questions that people have that they have burning that I can answer in just a couple minutes. Anyone have a question? Yeah, go ahead. The mic is right there.
Great, mics. So it sounds like IBM's been very open to open source for you to contribute. Do you have any recommendations for maybe employers that aren't as open to the open source community or contributing back?
Yeah, so I think a couple things I would say. One is find out where in your company open source is being consumed, and it doesn't have to be a big formal presentation, but if there needs to be some convincing about look at how we depend on open source across our company, or look how we're consuming it, we should probably do something to help out if possible. And again, company size and all those things factor in to that. The second is I would say in the last 5 to 10 years have been so many good, there's probably a few books, but I'm thinking even blog posts, articles that give you kind of some talking points about here's the value of us getting involved in open source. And again, there's no straightforward argument that seals the deal, but I think there's some good resources out there that may help you make that case. Anything else? Anything in the last few seconds? All right. Well, thank you very much for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of DockerCon. Thank you.